The shovel struck the earth with a sharp thud, shattering the silence of the still morning. David stood over his mother's grave, the early sunlight stretching long shadows across the cemetery. His hands trembled, not from the cold in the air, but from the storm raging inside him. Months. He had spent months questioning everything: her sudden death, the rushed funeral, and the way his father had avoided his gaze ever since. Something wasn't right. He could feel it deep in his bones. "I have to know," he whispered to himself, gripping the shovel even tighter. His mother, Clara, had been the kindest soul he had ever known. She hadn't just died. Someone had taken her from him. The doctors had called it a heart attack, but David refused to believe it. She had been healthy, full of life, and then in an instant, she was gone. The soil was still loose, the grave fresh. Scoop by scoop, he dug tirelessly, every movement fueled by burning muscles and sheer determination. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with tears he hadn't even realized he was shedding. But he didn't care. He didn't care what anyone thought. If the whole town called him crazy, so be it. He needed the truth. As the coffin came into view, David's heart pounded like a drum against his ribs. He hesitated, staring at the wooden box that held the woman who had raised him, loved him, protected him. But then he remembered her smile, her laughter, the way she had always told him to trust his instincts. This was for her. With a deep breath, he pried open the coffin lid. Creak. The hinges groaned, the sound echoing through the empty graveyard. And then he saw her. Clara lay there, still and pale, just as she had been at the funeral. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Her hands clenched, her nails broken, bloodied, her lips parted, as if she had tried to scream. David's breath hitched. No. No, no, no. His gaze snapped to the inside of the coffin lid, his entire body turning to ice. Scratches. Faint, desperate scratches. His blood ran cold. His mother hadn't died of a heart attack. She had been buried alive. A strangled gasp escaped his lips as his legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the damp grass, his chest heaving, his mind spiraling. The scratches. The bloodied nails. The clenched fists. It all pointed to the same horrifying truth. She had been awake when they buried her. Tears blurred his vision as he crawled back to the coffin, his hands shaking as they reached for her cold, lifeless fingers. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he choked out, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." But through the crushing grief, something ignited inside him. A fire. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. Someone had made sure she was buried before her time. And David was going to find out who. His fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone. The dial tone rang in his ears. Then, a calm voice answered on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? David swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I need to report a crime," he said, his grip tightening on the phone. "My mother, she was buried alive. I'm at the cemetery. Please, you need to come, now." As he waited for the sirens to arrive, one question haunted his mind. Who did this? His father? The thought made his stomach churn. Mark had been distant ever since Clara's death, but was he capable of this? And what about the doctors? The ones who had declared her dead. Had they been fooled, or were they in on it? The distant wail of sirens pulled him from his thoughts. The flashing lights cut through the morning calm as officers surrounded the grave, their faces shifting from confusion to shock as they took in the scene. David stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes locked onto the coffin. He felt numb, like he was watching a movie, like none of this was real. A tall, sharp-eyed woman approached him. "Detective Harris." "You the one who called?" she asked, her tone unreadable. David nodded, barely able to find his voice. "Yes. My mother, she was buried alive. I found her like this." The detective glanced at the coffin, her face darkening. She motioned for the forensic team to get to work, then turned back to him. "This is a serious accusation. Why did you dig up the grave?" David inhaled sharply, steadying himself, because something felt wrong. The funeral was rushed. My father, he's been acting strange ever since. I had to know the truth. Detective Harris nodded, scribbling in her notepad. And where is your father now? At home, I think, David replied. He doesn't know I'm here. The detective studied him for a long moment, then turned to one of her officers. Bring the father in for questioning. And get the medical examiner here, ASAP. David's stomach twisted. His father would be furious when he found out what he had done. But David didn't care. Because now he had proof.